I am Seraphina, a 28-year-old woman carrying the shattered soul of a survivor who spent 10 long years building an empire from the darkest mires of Manhattan, while the world indifferently stepped over my body, utterly unaware of my existence. The crystal chandeliers poured down like blood-stained blades, illuminating Priscilla's loathsome smirk as she stepped forward abruptly, hurling a glass of red wine onto my chest, leaving a long, dark stain like an open wound right in the middle of the plaza's luxurious grand ballroom. That cousin of mine, possessed by a devil's heart, did not stop there. She used her fingers adorned with priceless diamond rings to grip my chin firmly, forcing me to look up so that all 62 of New York's most elite individuals could witness the wretchedness of a sewer rat trying to learn how to be human. She spat out cruel words, calling me a cheap bastard of filthy blood, a creature fit only to stand in the back kitchen, washing dirty plates instead of daring to breathe the same air as the superiors, who were looking at me with utter disgust. The silence of the upper class tightened around me like a noose strangling my throat as they began to jeer, their whispers rising like the hissing of snakes, everyone craving to see me kneel and lick the spilled wine beneath their feet in exchange for a cowardly forgiveness. But instead of offering them my brokenness, a deathly coldness began to spread through my marrow, for I knew that every mocking laugh and every stain on this dress was the final shovel strike digging the grave for the entire sterling empire they so proudly boasted of. I stood still, letting the freezing liquid soak into my skin, my eyes unmoving as I looked directly into the stupidity of Priscilla, who had no idea she was insulting the true owner of this very building, the one holding the final breath of her lineage in the palm of her hand. That glamorous crowd was still reveling in the game of trampling a soul, unaware that the shadow architect behind the investment fund tightening the financial chokehold around their necks was the very woman whose dignity they had just spat upon. The betrayal of blood is a blood debt that must be paid in blood with the interest rates of hell, and tonight I am ready to strip it all away, turning their arrogance into the pitch-black ashes of bankruptcy and disgrace. If your heart has also been torn apart by contempt, if you have also been discarded by society like a worthless object, please stay here and embrace this pain with me to see how I reclaim justice from the world's brutality. Do not let me endure this coldness alone. Please subscribe and ring the bell as an affirmation that you stand with me, for your empathy is the only medicine to heal these bleeding scars and complete the death sentence for those who murdered my heart. The heavy doors of the plaza swung shut behind me with a muffled thud that seemed to signal the definitive end of my patience for the family that had discarded me like an old memory. I walked toward the valet stand with my head held high, despite the lingering echoes of Priscilla's insults still bouncing around the marble walls of the ballroom I had just exited. My boyfriend Alistair was waiting by the dark sedan, with an expression that shifted between deep embarrassment and a hollow attempt at comfort that he didn't quite know how to deliver. He reached out to touch my arm as if I were a fragile piece of glass that might shatter from the weight of a few cruel words spoken by a woman who had never understood my true worth. Alistair sighed heavily while he looked toward the ground because he lacked the courage to look me in the eye after standing silently while his social circles witnessed my public humiliation. I stepped back from his touch and informed him that his silence during that banquet spoke far louder than any whispered apology he could offer me in the privacy of a parking lot. The city air felt surprisingly cold against my skin as I told Alistair that I would be taking a separate car home because I needed a level of strength that he was clearly unable to provide tonight. I watched his car disappear into the neon blur of Fifth Avenue before turning to see a familiar figure standing near the shadows of the hotel's limestone pillars. My best friend Genevieve stepped forward with a fierce look in her eyes that told me she had heard every poisonous word Priscilla had spat in my direction during the dinner. Genevieve took my hand and reminded me that the Sterling family was currently walking on thin ice without realizing that I was the one controlling the temperature of the entire pond. She whispered that Priscilla had been bragging about a new line of credit earlier that evening, which confirmed my suspicion that they were desperate for a massive infusion of liquid capital. I thanked Genevieve for the information and promised her that the petty games of the Sterling dynasty would come to an abrupt and painful halt before the next sun began to rise over Manhattan. The drive to my private penthouse in the Upper East Side was conducted in a silence that allowed me to sharpen my resolve into a blade meant for corporate execution. I stepped into the elevator of my building, which recognized my thumbprint and whisked me up to a world that Marcus and Priscilla didn't even know existed within their exclusive zip code. My assistant Silas was already waiting in the study with 3 monitors glowing against the dark wood of the desk while he prepared the digital battlefield for the commands he knew were coming. I had hired Silas 3 years ago because he possessed a genius for tracking hidden cash flows and a loyalty that could never be bought by the superficial promises of old money families. Silas looked up from his screen to inform me that the Sterling Vance accounts were currently vulnerable due to their heavy reliance on the bridge loans I had secretly authorized through my holding company. I instructed Silas to immediately trigger the default clauses on the secondary credit lines that had been keeping my father's precious firm afloat during their recent expansion into the European markets. My father, Marcus, always believed he was the master of the board, but he never suspected that the daughter he exiled was the one paying the salaries of his executive board members for the last fiscal year. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window and watched the flickering lights of the city while Silas executed the digital strikes that would effectively paralyze the Sterling family's ability to borrow another dime. The border between family loyalty and the demand for justice had been crossed the moment Priscilla decided to turn my personal history into a public spectacle for the amusement of her wealthy friends. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction as Silas confirmed that the fund transfers were frozen and that the morning news would bring a reality check that no amount of Sterling charm could ever deflect. Silas asked if I wanted to leave them a window of negotiation for the upcoming week, but I told him to shut every door and lock every gate until they were forced to beg for mercy. The night was just beginning for the accountants at Sterling Vance, who would soon find themselves staring at empty ledgers while the woman they despised presided over their inevitable downfall from above. I sat down at my desk to review the final takeover documents because tomorrow would require a version of Seraphina that had no room for the sentimental ghosts of a childhood long since destroyed. Exactly at 8 o'clock in the morning, the digital clock flickered with a soulless number, but that was the opening shot for a financial massacre on Wall Street. When the glass towers of Manhattan had not yet caught the morning dawn, a wave of panic began to surge, crushing the proudest names. I sat in my office sipping a cup of bitter black coffee, my eyes calmly following the electronic board. The stock ticker for Sterling Vance wasn't just falling, it was in a free fall into a bottomless black hole, leaving a deadly gap the moment the floor opened. My phone vibrated incessantly on the mahogany desk. The name Priscilla appeared flickering like a belated plea for help from the one who just last night had driven me into a corner. I let it ring. I wanted her fear to have enough time to congeal into despair before I slowly picked up the phone, with a voice as cold as winter frost. Priscilla was no longer screaming with her usual arrogance. Now it was the whimper of a trapped animal. She spoke of foreclosure notices hand-delivered by federal marshals, of credit lines frozen in the blink of an eye. She shrieked, accusing me of playing a sick psychological game with the family heritage. I leaned back in my chair, my lips curling into a smile devoid of any warmth. Priscilla, the era of hollow arrogance is over. The magnificent ground you are standing on is actually just a thin sheet of glass, and I have just shattered it beneath your feet. I began to recite the deadly numbers, the financial loopholes, and the massive debts that had been concealed by glamour for the past 5 years. The other end of the line went dead silent. A heavy silence as she realized that the cousin she had insulted last night was the very one holding the noose around the neck of the entire Sterling empire. Amidst that storm, another call broke through. Marcus Sterling, the man I once called father. The booming voice of authority that used to command every boardroom was now nothing but trembling whispers. He asked me what I had done to the family's capital, asked why the investors were suddenly demanding an immediate liquidation of assets. I answered him with a brutal truth. That capital was never yours. It was built with the sweat, the intellect, and the very youth that you ruthlessly stole from me a decade ago. Marcus pleaded with me to think of family, of the lineage legacy. But I only softly reminded him, you officially murdered the word family the moment you stood by and watched Priscilla humiliate me like a piece of trash. Tonight, I officially fire the death sentence for the Sterling Vance dynasty. All the rot hidden behind their polished exterior is being exposed nakedly under the harsh sunlight. I hung up, leaving the hollow pleas behind. The bustling sounds of the city outside now sounded like a triumphal march for my freedom. The weight of 10 years of suffering had been forged by me into the sharpest blade of retribution. Every executive at Sterling Vance is fleeing like rats on a sinking ship. I watched the wave of red numbers flood the screen with a strange clarity. When a person has nothing left to lose, they become invincible. For the Sterling family, the sun has risen, but it is the darkest morning in their history of lies. As for me, this is only the beginning. The sun stood directly overhead above the skyscrapers of Manhattan as I stepped out of the black sedan and walked straight into the Sterling Vance headquarters without offering the security guard so much as a glance. The atmosphere inside the grand lobby was thick with the scent of expensive perfume mixed with a palpable electric tension as employees whispered frantically about the imminent bankruptcy of the firm. I stepped into the executive elevator with the absolute confidence of a woman who knew she owned every square inch of this tower because every cent of their debt was now firmly under my control. When the elevator doors slid open, I immediately saw Priscilla pacing like a trapped animal in the hallway while clutching a stack of useless legal documents in her trembling hands. She froze the moment our eyes met, and her face instantly contorted with a visceral hatred. Yet deep within, those eyes was a cold terror of the woman she had once tried to destroy. Marcus emerged from his office with the heavy, defeated sigh of a man who realized his life's work was being dismantled by the very daughter he had cast out a decade ago. I walked directly into the center of the boardroom where the major partners were seated and began to speak in a frigid tone that had been sharpened through 10 long years of exile. I looked Priscilla directly in the face and threw a stack of notarized documents onto the glass table that detailed exactly how she had forged my signature to steal my inheritance. The partners stared at one another in total shock as I stripped away the layers of filth and embezzlement Priscilla had used to ensure I was kicked out of the family with nothing. Priscilla tried to force a sneer and called the accusations the desperate ramblings of a bitter exile, but the cold numbers glaring back from the table did not know how to lie. My father, Marcus, stepped toward me and tried to place his hand on my shoulder to invoke the sacred bond of blood that had meant absolutely nothing on the night he threw me away. He used the hollow, authoritative voice of a parent to demand that I sign a rescue agreement so he could use my capital to fill the massive financial black hole of his own making. I looked Marcus in the eye and told him clearly that the title of father died the very second he chose to believe Priscilla's lies instead of protecting his own flesh and blood. He immediately showed his true colors by snarling that without the Sterling name, I would be nothing more than a zero in a city that has no mercy for the weak. I laughed at his staggering arrogance because he still failed to understand that the name Seraphina was now the only thing keeping the lights on and the staff paid in this building. I leaned over the table and delivered a final ultimatum regarding the immediate transfer of all voting shares, unless they wanted to spend the rest of their lives in prison for fraud. The room fell so silent that the only audible sound was the panicked, shallow breathing of Priscilla, as she realized her life of luxury was officially ending at this very moment. I told them that I was no longer the girl who could be bullied by a raised voice, or a threat of social banishment because I had built a fortress of my own from nothing. Priscilla went into a blind rage and lunged toward the table to grab the evidence of her crimes, but the security team I had brought with me pinned her arms behind her back instantly. Marcus looked at me with an expression of raw fear and a flicker of reluctant respect, as he finally grasped that the balance of power had shifted entirely into my hands. I informed the gathered partners that if I did not have their signed confirmation within the hour, a hostile takeover would officially commence, and the Sterling Vance name would be erased from history. The true nature of the elite was on full display as the partners began to physically distance themselves from Marcus and Priscilla to secure their own positions in the new regime I was building. I turned my back and walked toward the exit without looking at the wreckage of their egos, because the time for family sentiment had expired long ago for everyone in that room. The heavy glass doors slammed shut behind me to signal the end of a fraudulent reign and the beginning of the era I had spent 10 years in the shadows designing. I descended to the lobby with the absolute certainty that the next time I entered this building, I would be sitting in the corner office and personally signing the termination papers for those who had abandoned me. The power of life and death over their careers was now mine alone, and I felt no hesitation as I prepared to watch their hollow world collapse under the weight of the truth. I felt a strange, cold peace as I realized the ghosts of my past no longer carried any weight, because I had reclaimed my honor with my own 2 hands. The clock struck 4 in the afternoon as I kicked open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom and stepped inside to confront the management of Sterling Vance, whose faces were already pale with panic. I marched straight to the head of the table with the demeanor of someone returning from a financial battlefield, while the trembling directors scrambled to adjust their luxury silk ties in a desperate and futile effort to look composed. I sat down in the seat of ultimate authority without waiting for anyone to grant permission, because I was now the legal owner of every life and every cent currently existing within this room. Silas quietly placed the hostile takeover contracts onto the glass table, and the sharp sound of the paper hitting the surface signaled the end of a fraudulent dynasty that had existed for far too long. I glanced at the stunned faces before me and announced that V Legacy had swallowed every asset of the Sterling family during the blood-soaked trading hours that had just passed. Priscilla jumped up like a trapped animal with her finger trembling as she pointed at me while screaming about a fraudulent coup that she believed the family trust would somehow prevent. I looked at her with utter contempt because she was too stupid to understand that her shares were now nothing more than worthless scraps of paper on the stock exchange. I declared the immediate termination of Priscilla from every position within the corporation and ordered the security team to throw this woman out of the building before she could contaminate the air any further. Her arrogance crumbled right then and there as she looked at her former colleagues, who were the very people she used to command with money, but now only bowed their heads in silence to protect their own jobs. Priscilla tried to grab her Hermes bag to flee, but I blocked her and demanded that she surrender the corporate black credit card along with her office keys on the spot. Marcus sat at the end of the table with his head down like a soulless ghost, because he understood perfectly that the daughter he once discarded was now the only one with the power to decide if he ended up on the street. I ordered the immediate freezing of all personal accounts linked to the Sterling family and demanded a criminal forensic audit to bring every single one of their embezzlement schemes into the light of the law. The corruption that Marcus and Priscilla had nurtured for 10 years was now the very noose tightening around their necks, while my legal team began the proceedings to seize every piece of collateral. Their estate in the Hamptons and their luxury penthouse would soon be sealed to compensate for the massive debts they had illegally borrowed over the past several years. The arrogance of the Sterling dynasty was being dismantled piece by my cold commands and the decisive strokes of my fountain pen across the dissolution documents. I watched Priscilla being dragged away by security guards with a cardboard box containing a few of her cheap personal belongings, while the directors began to suck up to me with the most cowardly apologies. I ignored every single one of their cheap vows of loyalty because I knew they were only reacting out of a hunger for the new capital I was about to pour into their failing investment portfolios. Marcus looked up with bloodshot eyes and asked me where he was supposed to go now that his life's legacy had been swallowed by the daughter he should have protected. I looked directly into the face of that man and told him that his destination was no longer my concern because he had murdered our blood ties 10 years ago. I issued the new operational regulations to completely erase the culture of nepotism and declared that financial merit would be the only measure of survival under my new regime. Each director was given only 10 minutes to sign the new loyalty pledge or prepare themselves for an immediate investigation into the fraudulent expense reports that I had held in my hands for a long time. Priscilla was shoved into the service elevator in a state of severe shock, which was a bitter ending for someone who believed that money and cruelty could help her stand above the law forever. The sunset cast a deep red glow into the boardroom like a financial crime scene as the final transfer of power was completed in a silence that was truly bone-chilling. I remained in the high-backed chair to savor the cold sensation of victory and knew that this was the solid foundation for the new life I had built with my own hands from the ashes. Real power did not reside in the sterling name, but in the ruthlessness of a person who knew how to seize the moment to demand justice with a heart that had no room for mercy. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse as the private elevator chimed to signal that Marcus had finally arrived to beg for his survival. I did not move from my chair because I wanted him to feel the vast cold distance between his ruined world and the fortress I had built from the ashes he left me. He stepped into the foyer with none of the usual arrogance that had defined the sterling name for decades, and looked instead like a broken man searching for a way to cheat death. Marcus tried to use his fatherly tone to suggest that we should put the business rivalry aside and find a way to preserve what he called our shared family legacy. I watched him ramble about blood being thicker than water, while I held a folder containing the digital trail of Priscilla's most recent and most dangerous criminal activities. I waited until he reached the peak of his pathetic plea before I tossed the evidence of Priscilla's massive charity embezzlement onto the low marble table between us. Marcus went silent as he scanned the documents showing that his favorite daughter had been draining the foundation to pay off her massive gambling debts in Macau and London. The moment he realized the authorities were closing in the fatherly love he had preached for 30 years, vanished, and was replaced by a cold, calculating instinct for self-preservation. He did not ask how she was doing or try to protect her, because he immediately began to offer me his testimony against her in exchange for a complete legal immunity. It was the most disgusting display of cowardice I had ever witnessed, as he promised to provide the prosecutors with every encrypted password Priscilla had used to hide the stolen funds. I looked at this man and told him that the only thing more revolting than Priscilla's greed was his willingness to sell out his own flesh and blood to keep himself out of a prison cell. Marcus tried to justify his betrayal by claiming he was just being a practical businessman who knew when to cut his losses in a failing venture like a bad stock. I informed him that the word family had become a joke the second he chose to believe Priscilla's lies 10 years ago, and watched me disappear into the night without a single dollar. He tried to reach for my hand with a desperate, shaky grasp, but I pulled away with a look of loathing that finally shattered whatever remained of his ego. I told Marcus to get out of my home and to never contact me again, because I was officially erasing his name from my life and my future, starting this very second. The elevator doors closed on his defeated face, and I felt a profound sense of peace knowing that the man I once feared was nothing more than a hollow shell of greed. Meanwhile, Priscilla sat in her darkened mansion surrounded by the wreckage of her stolen prestige and felt the walls of reality closing in on her fractured mind. She had seen the leaked documents of her father's betrayal on a secure server, and her laughter began to echo through the empty halls with a terrifying, high-pitched insanity. She began to pack a small bag with burner phones and encrypted drives, while murmuring about a final act of sabotage that would burn my entire world to the ground. Priscilla no longer cared about the money or the company, because her only remaining purpose was to ensure that I suffered as much as she did in her final moments of freedom. The city outside was cold and indifferent to the destruction of the Sterling family, as the darkness of the night seemed to consume the last traces of their fraudulent empire. I stood by the window and realized that the people I had once wanted to impress were now just common criminals running from a fate they had designed for themselves. There was no room for reconciliation or mercy because they had proven that they would eat their own young just to stay relevant for one more miserable hour. Priscilla was now a dangerous shadow moving through the city with a plan to strike at the heart of my operation before the morning sun could expose her crimes. I prepared myself for the final collision because I knew that a cornered animal like my sister would do anything to avoid the inevitable silence of a prison cell. This was the bottom of the abyss where blood meant nothing, and the only thing that remained was the cold, hard reality of who had the most power to survive the night. The early morning mist clung to the streets of Manhattan as I woke up to a flurry of urgent notifications that signaled the start of a vicious smear campaign across every major media outlet. A series of leaked emails and fabricated documents began appearing on tabloid websites that accused me of using illegal insider information to orchestrate the takeover of Sterling Vance. I sat at my desk and watched as the internet became a breeding ground for lies that were clearly designed by Priscilla to destroy my credibility before the final merger signing scheduled for 10 o'clock. The digital landscape was suddenly flooded with photoshopped images and false testimonials from former colleagues who claimed that I had been fired years ago for financial misconduct. I reached out to Silas, who informed me that our main servers were currently under a massive distributed denial-of-service attack coming from an encrypted network based in Eastern Europe. Priscilla had clearly decided to spend her remaining illicit funds on a team of professional hackers to paralyze my operations at the most critical moment of my professional career. The situation grew even more dire when a pair of investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit arrived at my door with a warrant based on the forged evidence my family had provided. Just as the tension threatened to boil over into total chaos, Alistair arrived at my penthouse with a laptop containing the original metadata of the files that Priscilla had tried to manipulate. He stood by my side and explained to the investigators that he had personally witnessed Priscilla discussing the creation of these fake documents during a private family gathering weeks ago. Alistair's testimony provided the necessary leverage to stall the immediate arrest and gave me the window of opportunity I needed to execute my own defensive strategy. I realized that I had to trap Priscilla in her own web of deceit by providing her with a false sense of security through a controlled leak of my own sensitive data. I instructed Silas to open a specific backdoor in our secondary server that would lead the hackers directly to a set of encrypted files containing an embedded tracking virus. The trap was set perfectly as we monitored the real-time intrusion and watched the hackers begin to download what they believed were my private tax records and offshore account details. In reality, every byte they transferred was secretly transmitting their physical location and the digital fingerprints of the person who had authorized the payment for their services. I watched the monitor with a cold intensity while the virus successfully bypassed their firewalls and began to record the private video calls between Priscilla and her criminal associates. Priscilla appeared on the screen, looking disheveled and frantic as she barked orders to the hackers to delete every trace of my existence from the corporate database before the sun was fully up. The federal agents who were still in my apartment watched the live feed in stunned silence as the true architect of the sabotage was revealed through her own narcissistic confession. I turned to the investigators and handed them a hard drive containing 10 years of Priscilla's financial records, which I had been meticulously compiling since the day I was exiled. The evidence was now undeniable because we had captured a felony in progress, along with a decade of systemic fraud that would send the entire Sterling leadership to prison. The hackers realized they were being traced and tried to disconnect, but Silas had already locked their system and began the process of wiping their remote servers clean. Alistair looked at me with a mixture of relief and admiration as he realized that I had anticipated every move my family would make in their final moments of desperation. The clock struck 10 as the lead investigator picked up his radio to coordinate a simultaneous raid on the Sterling family estate and Priscilla's private residence in the city. I felt no joy in watching the downfall of my own blood relatives, but I did feel a profound sense of justice for the younger version of myself who had been left to drown in their lies. The morning sun finally broke through the gray clouds and illuminated the city with a golden light that seemed to signify the cleansing of the corruption that had plagued my name. I stood by the window and watched the police sirens fade into the distance while knowing that the final chapter of my retribution was finally drawing to a definitive close. The massive screen in my private executive suite broadcast the final humiliation of the Sterling dynasty while I signed the last document to legally erase their surname from my existence. I watched with a cold and clinical detachment as the judge delivered a sentence that was far more severe than any of the legal pundits had predicted during the trial. Priscilla was not just sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal prison, but she was also ordered to pay restitution that stripped her of every single asset she had ever owned. The camera zoomed in on her face as she was dragged out of the courtroom in cheap handcuffs, and I saw the exact moment her sanity finally fractured under the weight of reality. The media had turned on her with a viciousness that only the public can muster, because they realized that the socialite they once worshipped was nothing more than a fraud in a stolen dress. She screamed my name into the microphones in a desperate attempt to blame me for her crimes, but the world simply watched her meltdown with a mixture of disgust and entertainment. My father Marcus managed to avoid a prison cell through a cowardly plea deal, yet his punishment was arguably far worse for a man who lived entirely for his ego. He was permanently banned from serving as an officer of any public company and was forced to move into a subsidized housing project in a neighborhood he wouldn't have driven through a year ago. I received a report this morning stating that he now works as a greeter at a discount department store, where he is forced to smile at customers who don't even know his name. The humiliating irony of his new life is a poetic justice that no amount of money could buy, because he is now invisible in the very city he once thought he owned. I placed the pen down on my mahogany desk and looked out at the skyline of Manhattan, which now featured the Vance Global logo glowing brightly atop the tallest tower. The phone on my desk remained silent because I had instructed my security team to permanently block any calls or letters attempting to reach me from the correctional facility or the housing project. Alistair walked into the room not with flowers or romance, but with the quarterly earnings report that showed our new conglomerate had outperformed every competitor in the market. We didn't celebrate with champagne or parties because victory in this world is not an event, but a continuous state of being that requires constant vigilance and absolute ruthlessness. The elite circle of New York had quickly realigned their loyalties to the person who held the checkbook, and I found their sudden respect to be as hollow as their previous disdain. I accepted their invitations only when it served my strategic interests, because I understood that in this concrete jungle, there are no friends, but only temporary alliances based on mutual profit. The complete destruction of the Sterling family was necessary not just for my revenge, but to send a clear message to anyone who might consider crossing me in the future. I want every person watching this to understand that the world does not reward the meek or the forgiving when you are dealing with predators who want to consume your legacy. You must be willing to burn the bridge while your enemies are still standing on it if you want to ensure that they can never follow you into your future. The price of my freedom was the total annihilation of the people who raised me, and I paid that bill without a single moment of hesitation or regret. My father and sister are now just cautionary tales that people whisper about at cocktail parties, while I stand here as the living proof that power belongs to those who take it. Do not let anyone tell you that family is sacred when that family is actively trying to destroy your potential and steal the fruits of your hard labor. You have the right to cut out the cancer from your life, regardless of whose blood runs through its veins, because your survival is the only thing that truly matters. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk to begin the next chapter of my expansion, because the throne I have built requires my full attention. The past is a dead weight that I have cut loose and watched sink into the abyss, while I continue to rise toward a height they could never imagine. The story of Seraphina is not a fairy tale about forgiveness, but a blueprint for how to win a war when the entire world is betting on your failure.